Last night with Rachel, Dr. Paul having said that had he been around, he would have tried to modify the parts of the Civil Rights Act with which he disagreed. Earlier tonight, claiming to CNN's Wolf Blitzer that he apparently would have voted for legislation he believed was flawed.
If you had been a member of the Senate or the House back in 1964, would you have voted yay or nay for the Civil Rights Act?
Yes, I would have voted yes.
In response to a question about whether the private department store Woolworths had the right to segregate at its lunch counters in places like Greensboro, North Carolina during the 1960s, Dr. Paul tonight claiming that he believes federal intervention had been necessary.
I think that there was an overriding problem in the South so big that it did require federal intervention in the 60s.
We're joined now by the House Majority Whip, Congressman Jim Clyburn, the Democrat of South Carolina. Great, thanks for your time tonight, Congressman.
Thank you so much for having me.
What was your first reaction when you heard Rand Paul's views on the Civil Rights Act, and has anything that he said since during this day changed that first reaction?
No, nothing he said has changed the first reaction, which was absolutely astounding. I just could not believe what I was watching last night as I watched him respond to 14th Amendment questions with a Second Amendment answer. It was just incredible to me. And to hear him talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as if there is no 1968 fair housing law. I would like to know how he feels about that law. In fact, he wrote a letter, I understand, to the editor of his local newspapers opposing the fair housing law of 1968. What does he feel about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, that law that allowed me to be serving here in the Congress? I don't know that this guy isn't still parsing words by limiting his comments to one section of the 64 Civil Rights Act. It tells me that he's got problems with other laws that we've come to accept as a part of the American way.
Well, his defense today seems predicated on this. This was not an issue. This is merely a red herring, a political ploy. He blamed Rachel Maddow for the interview. And then the letter to the editor that you mentioned from 2002, he said basically the same thing. I mean, the quote that, I'll read this one again, read it once, but a free society, he wrote, will abide unofficial private discrimination even when that means allowing hate-filled groups to exclude people based on the color of their skin. Is that a red herring, or is this now a theme to a man's perspective on what's discrimination and what's not in this society?
Well, he was in the public arena with this attitude a long, long time, and I find it kind of interesting that other leading Republicans, to include the senator from my home state, have been out here pushing his candidacy, wanting him to be the nominee of their party for the Tea Party movement, to endorse him, for him to cloak himself in the Tea Party movement, set himself up as a spokesperson for the Tea Party movement. I think we'll now be getting a full picture of exactly what the Tea Party movement is all about.
Rand Paul is blaming us for misunderstanding him when he said private businesses should be allowed to discriminate. When someone's running to be a federal legislator, does the media have the right to question him about his views on the role of the federal government, especially when it turns out he wrote letters to the editor that line up nicely with what he said last night, but the letter was in 2002?
Well, of course. That's why I was talking to my old colleagues at the Courier-Journal in Louisville, where I started out. They had an op-ed page board meeting there in April, and they asked him all these questions. And sure, they had a right to do it, and they did do it. And, you know, the interesting thing is that they published the answers, and they based their editorial in the Courier-Journal not endorsing either candidate in the Republican primary based on those answers.
So the comments were made on that show to NPR, to 2 Kentucky newspapers. He's now gotten the Civil Rights Act involved, the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, too. We haven't mentioned that. He said he still disagreed with that. on CNN tonight. He doubled down on that. He had a spokesman who had to resign in December because of the heavy metal band that he belonged to that dressed up in outfits that referenced the Ku Klux Klan. Is the sum total of everything here so potentially damaging? Because it doesn't seem like it's like these are the proverbial collection of isolated incidents here.
Well, it's always interesting, as the Sherlock Holmes used to write about the dogs that don't bark.
Yeah.
I'm waiting to hear from Karl Rove on this one. I haven't heard him rush to the microphone to defend Rand Paul. That should tell you a lot. I think I called the RNC today. Michael Steele, the head of the RNC, he didn't really know much about it because he was traveling in Tampa, Florida. Tampa apparently not, being penetrated by the national media. The Republicans are hunkered down because they know that watching this guy cling to the last vestige of libertarianism on the Civil Rights Act is something that is not good for the Republican Party. Wolf Blitzer sort of backed him into the corner, but not fully, because as you did in your soundbite there, Rand Paul is still saying that the Civil Rights Act and its public accommodation stuff was necessary for the South in the 60s. Does that mean he doesn't think it's necessary now in the whole country? That question's still out there. The Republicans don't like that question being out there.
Surprisingly, even Rand Paul himself took a few steps away from himself today.
What do you think you're going to get when you go on Rachel Maddow's show? That's the kind of questions you are going to get.
You're right, and it was a poor political decision. Probably won't be happening anytime in the near future. Seemed to have unleashed some of the loony left on me.
As the day just kept getting worse, in the late afternoon, Dr. Paul finally tried to walk his position way, 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 way back.
Would you have voted yay or nay for the Civil Rights Act?
Yes, I would have voted yes. I think that there was an overriding problem in the South so big that it did require federal intervention in the 60s.
And that is a brand new position. It is quite a distance from where he was on this issue last month when he spoke to the Courier-Journal, yesterday afternoon when he spoke with National Public Radio, and definitely last night with me. The controversy here is not because something has been taken out of context. This isn't him being held to account for essentially a misstatement or something blurted out in the heat of argument. As long ago as 2002, Dr. Rand Paul wrote to his local paper in Bowling Green, Kentucky, to chastise the newspaper for endorsing the Fair Housing Act, which prohibits housing discrimination. In that letter, he wrote, quote, "A free society will abide unofficial private discrimination, even when that means allowing hate-filled groups to exclude people based on the color of their skin." Despite everyone, including Rand Paul himself, now sprinting away from Rand Paul's position on civil rights, the fact remains that Kentucky Republicans have as their nominee for United States Senate a candidate who says that while he personally abhors this, anyone who wants to do this today is within their rights to do it. And the government was wrong to stop it when they did.